The letter arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, pristine and precise, like a blade waiting to slice through the fabric of my life. I remember standing in the stark fluorescent light of the hospital break room, my scrub still bearing the faint traces of an earlier emergency, when I first saw the law firm's letterhead. Holding that envelope felt like grasping a live wire, my fingers trembled with an electricity I couldn't explain. "Maria, we need you in room 304. Sarah's voice cut through my reverie, and I quickly tucked the envelope into my pocket. The weight of it pressed against my thigh throughout my shift, a constant reminder of the unknown waiting to be unveiled. As a nurse at Sterling Memorial, I'd learned to compartmentalize, to push personal matters aside while attending to the immediate needs of others. But this was different. This letter carried a gravity that demanded attention. Hours later, I sat at our kitchen table, the envelope now smoothed flat before me. John leaned against the counter, his attorney's skepticism evident in the tight line of his mouth. The evening light painted shadows across his face, deepening the furrows of concern that had become more pronounced in recent years. "It could be anything, Maria. These days, scammers are getting more sophisticated." His words carried the weight of countless cases he'd handled, victims of elaborate schemes and false promises. "Let me look into the firm first." I traced the embossed letters with my fingertip, feeling the ridges and valleys of each character. "Blackwood, Harrison and Associates. They seem legitimate." My voice sounded distant, even to my own ears. Something about this felt different from the usual scams John warned about. There was a precision to it, a specificity that spoke of authenticity. The letter's contents hit like a thunderbolt. "We regret to inform you of the passing of Mr. James Connor Blackwood. As his biological daughter, you are named as a primary beneficiary in his will." The words blurred before my eyes, each sentence a revelation that threatened to unravel everything I thought I knew about myself. James Connor Blackwood. A name my mother had never spoken, a shadow that had haunted the edges of my childhood questions. Now here he was, emerging from the grave with an inheritance that promised to change everything. The sum mentioned in the letter made my head spin, 8 figures that would transform our lives overnight. John's reaction was immediate and protective. "This doesn't add up, Maria. Your mother never mentioned him having money like this. Why would he leave everything to a daughter he never knew?" His legal instincts were kicking in, looking for the catch, the hidden trap. But as I sat there, memories began to surface, fragments of conversations overheard in childhood, the way my mother would sometimes stare at old photographs with tears in her eyes, the mysterious deposits that appeared in our account during particularly difficult times. All these pieces suddenly aligned into a pattern I'd been too young to recognize. "I need to know the truth, John." My voice had found its strength, carrying a determination that surprised even me. If this man was my father, if he tried to be part of my life in some way, I deserved to know. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay awake, watching shadows dance across our bedroom ceiling, each one seeming to take the shape of possibilities and dangers. John's steady breathing beside me provided little comfort. Instead, I found myself drawn to the window, staring out at the city lights that dotted the darkness like earthbound stars. My phone glowed with open browser tabs. Searches about James Connor Blackwood revealed a successful business empire, philanthropic endeavors, and a family life I'd never been part of. Photos showed a man with my eyes, my determined chin, standing proudly beside a woman and son at various social events. Paul Blackwood, my apparent half-brother, featured prominently in recent articles about the company's expansion plans. The last photo I found sent chills down my spine. James Blackwood at a charity gala just 6 months ago, looking directly at the camera with an expression that seemed to hold secrets. He'd known he was my father all this time, had watched me grow up from a distance, and had waited until his death to acknowledge me. The question that burned in my mind, that would keep me awake until dawn, was simple yet devastating: why? As the first rays of sunlight began to pierce the darkness, I made my decision. I would meet with the lawyers, I would uncover the truth, and I would claim what was rightfully mine, not just the inheritance, but the answers to questions that had shaped my entire existence. What I couldn't know then, as I watched the sun rise on this new chapter of my life, was that some truths come with a price that no inheritance could cover, and some answers lead to questions far darker than the ones we began with. The law office of Blackwood, Harrison and Associates towered before me like a monument to power, its glass facade reflecting the morning sun with an intensity that seemed to mock my uncertainties. My reflection fractured across its surface, a nurse in civilian clothes, trying to look like she belonged in this world of mahogany and money. John's absence felt like a physical void beside me, his skepticism still ringing in my ears from our morning argument. "This could destroy everything we've built," he'd warned, his coffee growing cold between us. "Sometimes the past should stay buried, Maria." But he didn't understand that the past had never been buried, it had merely lain dormant, waiting for this precise moment to emerge. The elevator ascended silently, each floor marking another step away from the life I knew. My hands, usually steady enough to thread the finest needle, trembled slightly as I smoothed my dress. The outfit had seemed appropriate at home, but now felt like a costume, a futile attempt to blend into a world that had rejected me before I could even speak. "Ms. Martinez?" The receptionist's voice carried the polished edge of practiced neutrality. "Mr. Harrison will see you now." The name on the door read Thomas Harrison, senior partner, each letter etched in gold that seemed to pulse with unspoken significance. I wasn't prepared for what waited behind that door. Paul Blackwood stood by the window, his stance radiating the easy confidence of someone who had never questioned his place in the world. The resemblance to the photos I'd studied was striking, but what knocked the breath from my lungs was how much he looked like the man in my mirror, those eyes, that jaw, the set of his shoulders. Our father's features, divided between us like some cruel genetic lottery. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing," Paul's voice cut through the air, sharp as surgical steel, "but I won't let you destroy my father's legacy with these ridiculous claims." His words carried the weight of old money and older prejudices, each syllable a carefully aimed arrow. Thomas Harrison, a man whose age seemed to have crystallized him rather than weathered him, raised a placating hand. "Mr. Blackwood, please. We've verified Ms. Martinez's claim thoroughly. The DNA results are conclusive." He slid a folder across his desk, its contents spilling out like secrets finally breaking free. My hands moved of their own accord, touching the documents that proved what I'd always felt in my bones. Birth certificate, medical records, and there, a photograph I'd never seen before. My mother, young and radiant, her arms around a man whose features I now saw every day in Paul's hostile glare. They looked happy, in love even. The date stamp mocked me, 3 months before my birth. "These are obviously forgeries," Paul spat, his composure cracking. "My father would never, he wasn't that kind of man." But I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the same uncertainty that had haunted my own reflection for years. "Your father maintained a separate account for Ms. Martinez and her mother for years," Harrison continued, his tone measured but firm. "Regular deposits, educational trust funds, medical coverage, all through shell companies to maintain privacy. He protected them, in his way. Protected us?" The word tasted bitter. Protection would have been presence, not secret deposits and hidden truths. Each revelation was another piece of a puzzle I'd never known I was meant to solve, each document another blow to the foundation of Paul's certainty. "The will is clear," Harrison pressed on, seemingly immune to the tension crackling between Paul and me. "Equal division of assets between both children, with specific provisions for the company's future management. Your father was very thorough in his planning." Paul's laugh held no humor. "You expect me to believe he'd leave half of everything, half of what generations of Blackwoods built, to a stranger? To some nurse who appears out of nowhere with convenient papers and sad stories?" The dismissal in his tone ignited something in me, a fire that had been smoldering since that first letter arrived. "I didn't ask for any of this," I shot back, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside. "I didn't ask to be born into secrecy, to grow up wondering why I didn't have a father, to discover my entire existence was some carefully managed inconvenience. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with decades of unspoken pain. Paul's face shifted, something unreadable flickering across his features. For a moment, I saw past the armor of privilege and prejudice to someone else whose world was unraveling, a mirror image of my own confusion and anger, reflected through a different lens. "This meeting is over," Paul announced abruptly, gathering his coat. "My lawyers will be in touch. I suggest you prepare yourself, Ms. Martinez. The Blackwood family protects its own." The threat in his voice was clear as crystal. As the door closed behind him, Harrison sighed heavily. "Your father anticipated this reaction. There's something else you need to see." He reached into his desk drawer, withdrawing an envelope that bore my name in unfamiliar handwriting. "He left this for you, to be delivered only if Paul contested the will." The envelope felt heavy with more than just paper, it carried the weight of secrets yet to be revealed, of truths that could either heal or destroy. As I slipped it into my bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just stepped onto a battlefield I never knew existed, in a war that had been raging since before I drew my first breath. Outside, the city continued its relentless pace, oblivious to how my world had just shifted on its axis. My phone buzzed with a message from John. How did it go? But how could I possibly explain that I'd walked into that office as Maria Martinez, and walked out as someone else entirely, someone with a brother who hated me, a dead father who'd loved me from a distance, and a letter that promised to change everything once again? The envelope sat before me on our kitchen table like a live grenade, its contents threatening to detonate what remained of my carefully constructed life. Outside, rain pelted against windows that reflected my distorted image, a woman I barely recognized anymore, caught between who I'd been and who I was becoming. John's words from our latest argument still hung in the air, acrid as smoke. "You're chasing ghosts, Maria. This obsession is destroying us." Perhaps he was right. The Maria he'd married would have walked away from this inheritance, this maze of family secrets. That Maria had been content with certainties, the solid ground of her nursing career, the predictable rhythm of their marriage, the clear boundaries between past and present. But that Maria had died the moment she'd opened that first letter, and in her place stood someone else, someone forged in the crucible of revelation and betrayal. My hands trembled as I broke the seal on my father's letter, each torn fiber of the envelope marking another point of no return. His handwriting flowed across the page with an elegance that spoke of privilege and power, each word a bridge across the chasm of our shared silence. "My dearest Maria. If you're reading this, then Paul has reacted exactly as I feared he would. The truth I'm about to share will shake the foundations of everything he believes, everything I built. But you deserve to know why I stayed in the shadows of your life, why I watched from a distance as you grew into the remarkable woman you've become. Your mother wasn't just a passing affair, as I let everyone believe. She was the love of my life, and you were the child of that love. But the Blackwood Empire was built on appearances, on carefully curated lies that preserved power through generations. When she told me she was pregnant, I made the most cowardly choice of my life. I chose the facade over the truth. The proof you need is in a safety deposit box at First National Bank, Box 1147. The key is enclosed. What you'll find there will ensure your rightful place in the Blackwood legacy, but it comes with a warning: Paul isn't just fighting for money. He's fighting to preserve a lie that goes deeper than you can imagine. The key fell from the envelope like a tear of brass, heavy with the weight of secrets yet to be uncovered. I held it up to the dim kitchen light, watching it cast shadows that danced like the ghosts of decisions long past. My mother's reaction when I'd confronted her had been a study in carefully constructed evasion. "The past is past, Maria," she'd said, her hands nervously arranging and rearranging her teacup. "Some doors are better left closed." But I'd seen the fear behind her eyes, the way she'd flinched at James Blackwood's name as if it were a physical blow. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through the information I'd gathered about Paul Blackwood. News articles painted him as the golden son, the heir apparent who'd expanded the family business into new territories. But there were whispers in financial forums about aggressive takeovers, about small companies that mysteriously folded after refusing to sell. Behind each triumph lurked shadows of destruction, a pattern that felt too familiar to be coincidence. The hospital's night shift had taught me that healing sometimes requires opening old wounds, draining the poison before recovery can begin. Each revelation about my father felt like surgical steel, cutting away layers of comfortable illusion to expose raw truth beneath. The inheritance wasn't just money, it was an identity I'd been denied, a birthright buried under decades of careful deception. A text from Sarah at the hospital lit up my phone. "That lawyer was here asking questions about you. Very interested in your work history, any mistakes? Watch your back." The message sent ice through my veins. Paul was moving faster than I'd anticipated, already trying to discredit me professionally. John found me still at the kitchen table hours later, surrounded by printouts and notes like a detective mapping a crime scene. His face softened at the sight of me, concern temporarily overwhelming his frustration. "You haven't slept properly in days," he said softly. "Whatever's in that safety deposit box, is it worth all this?" I looked up at him, really looked, seeing the worry lines that had deepened around his eyes since this all began. "It's not about the money anymore," I replied, my voice hoarse from unshed tears. "It's about truth. About justice. About every birthday card never sent, every father-daughter dance missed, every moment stolen because someone decided I was inconvenient to their perfect narrative." The distance between us stretched like a growing fault line, each of us standing on opposite sides of a widening chasm. John was a man who believed in order, in systems, in problems that could be solved through proper legal channels. But what I was discovering went beyond the law, it lived in the shadows between right and wrong, in the gray areas where power wrote its own rules. My phone buzzed again, an email from an anonymous account. The subject line made my heart stop: "What really happened to James Blackwood?" The attachment was a medical examiner's preliminary report, marked confidential. My nursing training kicked in as I read, recognizing the subtle discrepancies that suggested something more sinister than the official heart attack ruling. The truth was a mosaic, and I was only beginning to see the pattern emerging from its scattered pieces. Each revelation felt like another step into darkness, but there was no turning back now. I'd spent my life healing others' wounds, now it was time to lance the festering secrets that had shaped my existence. As dawn began to paint the sky in shades of possibility, I made my decision. The safety deposit box wouldn't just give me ammunition for the inheritance battle, it would give me the power to reshape the narrative that had confined me to the margins of my own story. Paul wanted a war. I'd give him one, fought not with his weapons of money and influence, but with the sharp blade of truth that had been waiting decades to draw blood. The safety deposit box key burned in my palm like a brand of destiny as I stood before First National Bank. Dawn painted the sky in watercolor shades of judgment, and I watched my reflection fragment across the bank's brass doors, a woman transformed by the crucible of truth, wearing determination like armor. Inside the vault, the lock's mechanism yielded to my key with a sound like fate's own whisper. The metal box emerged from its sanctuary, heavy with the weight of secrets that would either save or destroy me. My hands, steady through countless medical procedures, trembled as I laid it on the viewing table. The contents spilled out like a flood of crystallized time, photographs, letters, legal documents, each piece a testament to a love affair that had shaped my existence without my knowledge. But it was the USB drive, innocuous in its plastic casing, that drew my attention like a beacon. My father's distinctive handwriting marked it simply: insurance. Hours later, in my home office, the drive's contents unfolded before me like a masterclass in betrayal. Financial records spanning decades revealed a pattern that made my blood run cold. The Blackwood Empire, that gleaming monument to generational wealth, was built on foundations of sand and shadows. Systematic fraud, environmental violations, strategic bankruptcies, each file a chapter in a story of calculated destruction. Maria? John's voice carried concern as he entered, but I barely heard him. My eyes were fixed on a particular series of transactions that painted a picture darker than I'd imagined. Paul's fingerprints were all over the company's most egregious violations, but there was something else, something that made my medical instincts scream in warning. "Look at these medical reports," I whispered, spreading printouts across my desk. Father's heart condition was manageable with medication. But these toxicology screens from his last physical. The numbers told a story that turned my professional knowledge into a weapon of revelation. John leaned over my shoulder, his attorney's mind processing the implications. "This goes beyond inheritance fraud," he said slowly, his previous skepticism dissolving in the face of evidence. "If what you're suggesting is true." Paul didn't just want to protect his inheritance, I finished, the words tasting like ash. He needed to silence our father before the truth came out. Before he could make things right. My phone buzzed, another message from Sarah at the hospital. "They're digging deeper, Maria. Someone accessed your personnel files today. Official request, but something feels wrong." The walls were closing in, Paul's influence reaching into every corner of my life like poisonous ivy. I opened my laptop, fingers flying across keys as I compiled everything I'd discovered. Each document was a bullet in the chamber of justice, waiting to be fired. But as I worked, a new message appeared in my inbox, anonymous, like the last, but carrying an attachment that made my heart stutter. Photos of me. Outside the hospital, at the grocery store, entering my home. Recent photos. The message was clear: I was being watched, evaluated, measured for my own coffin of silence. The rage that rose in me was glacial, crystalline in its clarity. I'd spent my life healing, nurturing, believing in the fundamental goodness of people. But now I understood what my father had learned too late: sometimes the only way to excise a cancer is to cut deep, to sacrifice healthy tissue in pursuit of cure. John's hand on my shoulder anchored me to reality. "We need to be smart about this," he said, his legal mind already mapping strategies. "One wrong move and..." "I'm done playing defense," I cut him off, my voice carrying an edge I barely recognized. "Paul thinks he's hunting me. He's about to learn what happens when you back a healer into a corner. We healers know exactly where to place the knife to cause maximum damage." I reached for my phone, scrolling to a number I discovered in the files, a journalist known for exposing corporate corruption. My finger hovered over the dial button as John's words from weeks ago echoed in my mind: "Sometimes the past should stay buried." But the past was already exhumed, its bones scattered across my life like evidence at a crime scene. The woman I'd been, the one who believed in clean resolutions and happy endings, was dead, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes justice requires getting blood on your hands. The phone rang once, twice, and then a voice answered: "Claire Bennett, investigative reporter." "Ms. Bennett," I said, my voice steady as a surgeon's hand. "I have a story you might be interested in. It's about the Blackwood family, and what really happened to James Blackwood." As I spoke, I felt the last bridges to my old life burn behind me. But ahead lay something more valuable than peace, truth, justice, and the power to rewrite a narrative that had constrained me for too long. Paul had spent his life wielding power like a blade. Now it was my turn to show him that some weapons cut both ways. In the growing darkness of my office, surrounded by evidence of decades of deception, I finally understood what my father's letter had truly meant. This wasn't just about claiming an inheritance, it was about claiming the power to shape reality itself. And I was done letting others write my story. The weight of revelation pressed against my chest like a stone as Claire Bennett's latest email illuminated my screen. Each word pulsed with dangerous possibility, a rhythm that matched the thundering of my heart. The journalist had done more than verify my evidence, she'd uncovered a labyrinth of corruption that made my initial discoveries seem like mere shadows of the truth. My hands traced the rim of my coffee cup, now cold and forgotten in the pre-dawn darkness of my home office. 3 days had passed since I'd made the decision to go nuclear, to tear down the facade of Blackwood respectability brick by carefully mortared brick. The evidence Claire uncovered painted a picture so dark it made even my suspicious mind reel: environmental disasters carefully buried, whistleblowers who disappeared into the machinery of silence, and through it all, Paul's signature on documents that reeked of calculated malevolence. The monitor's glow cast my reflection in the window, a ghostly oracle reading prophecies in the darkness. Behind that spectral image, the city sprawled like a circuit board of light and shadow, each point of illumination representing lives that had been touched, perhaps destroyed, by the Blackwood Empire's toxic reach. "You need to see this," I texted John, attaching Claire's latest findings. My husband had transformed from skeptic to strategist, his legal mind now fully engaged in the chess game we were playing. His reply came swift and sharp: "This changes everything. Don't move until I get home." But waiting had become a luxury I could no longer afford. Paul's counterattack had begun with surgical precision. Yesterday, the hospital board had received anonymous complaints about my professional conduct. Today, our mortgage company flagged irregularities in our account. The noose was tightening, each squeeze a reminder that power didn't play by rules, it wrote them. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message that made my blood freeze. "Thought you should know, Mrs. Elena Martinez admitted to St. Luke's an hour ago. Severe anxiety attack. Asking for you." The text was from my old nursing school friend, now working at my mother's hospital. The game board shifted beneath my feet like quicksand. Paul had found my mother, had weaponized her vulnerability against me. The master stroke I'd been planning suddenly felt hollow in the face of this intimate attack. I grabbed my keys, my mind racing through possibilities like a computer processing threat scenarios. The drive to St. Luke's carved through my consciousness like a scalpel, each mile marking another step in my evolution from victim to avenger. My mother's face, pale against hospital sheets, told a story of pressure applied with expert precision. "They came to talk about James," she whispered, her voice thin as tissue paper. "They knew things, Maria. Things I never told anyone." The monitor beside her bed beeped steadily, each pulse a metronome marking time in this symphony of destruction. I held her hand, feeling the tremors that betrayed her terror, and something inside me crystallized, hard and sharp as diamond. Back in my car, I pulled out the burner phone I'd bought 3 days ago. Claire answered on the first ring. "I'm running it tomorrow," she said without preamble. "The story's solid. But Maria, there's something else. Something about your father's company in South America. The numbers don't add up, and people who ask questions tend to stop asking them permanently." The implications settled over me like a shroud. This wasn't just about inheritance or family secrets anymore, it was about a legacy of destruction that spanned continents. My father's insurance files had been just the surface, a prelude to horrors that dwelled in deeper waters. I drove home through streets that felt different now, each familiar landmark transformed by new understanding. The woman who'd started this journey seeking answers had been replaced by someone harder, someone who understood that justice and vengeance sometimes wore the same face. John was waiting when I arrived, his lawyer's briefcase bulging with documents. "I've been going through everything," he said, spreading papers across our dining table. "There's a pattern here, Maria. The way they handle threats, the way they eliminate problems. But there's also a weakness, a point where the whole house of cards could collapse." The USB drive from my father's safety deposit box lay between us like a detonator. "It's not just about exposing them," I said, my voice carrying the weight of recent understanding. "It's about surviving the explosion." My mother's frightened face flashed before me, a preview of collateral damage to come. Paul's latest email sat unopened in my inbox, its subject line a mockery of familial connection: "A sister should know when to fold." The old Maria might have been intimidated. But I wasn't that woman anymore. Each attack, each attempt to silence me, had forged something new, someone who understood that healing sometimes required cauterization, that mercy could be a weapon when wielded precisely. As midnight approached, I began composing my response, not to Paul's email, but to the world that had allowed the Blackwoods to operate in shadows for so long. My fingers flew across the keyboard, weaving truth and evidence into a noose that would hang them with their own words. Claire's story would break tomorrow, but it would be just the beginning. I had learned from my adversaries, patience was a predator's greatest virtue. And I was done being prey. The morning Claire's story broke, I stood in my hospital's chapel, watching dawn paint the stained glass windows in shades of judgment. Each color felt like a different facet of the truth I'd unleashed: blood red for family betrayal, deep purple for power corrupted, golden amber for justice finally served. My reflection fragmented across the colored panes, a kaleidoscope of the woman I'd become. My phone vibrated steadily, an earthquake of consequences unleashing across the city. The Blackwood Empire was burning, and I had struck the match. Claire's exposé wasn't just a story, it was a precision-guided missile that struck at the very foundation of their power. The evidence we'd uncovered revealed decades of systematic corruption, environmental crimes, and something far darker, a pattern of convenient accidents befalling those who threatened to expose the truth. "The board is meeting in an hour," John's text illuminated my screen. Paul's trying to maintain control, but the shareholders are in revolt. The stock is in free fall. Each word felt like another nail in the coffin of the Blackwood legacy, a legacy built on bones and sealed with silence. I traced my fingers along the cold wooden pew, remembering how I'd once believed in simple truths, in right and wrong, in justice served through proper channels. The woman who believed those things felt like a stranger now, as distant as childhood memories of wondering why I had no father to attend school events. The chapel door opened, admitting a figure I'd seen only in photographs and across conference tables. Paul's wife, Catherine, stood framed in the doorway like a portrait of desperate dignity. Her Hermes scarf couldn't quite hide the tremor in her throat, her designer sunglasses failing to mask the fear in her eyes. "He's going to lose everything," she said, her voice carrying the weight of shattered privilege. "The house, the company, our children's future, was that your goal? Complete destruction?" I stood slowly, feeling the weight of every decision, every calculated move that had led to this moment. "Tell me, Catherine, did you know about the factory in Brazil? About the children who died when the river turned toxic? Or did you just enjoy the profits without asking questions?" Her flinch told me everything. The Blackwood way had always been selective blindness, comfortable ignorance purchased with blood money. I'd seen the medical reports, had wept over photographs of deformed infants and cancer-riddled communities. Some sins couldn't be buried, no matter how deep you dug the grave. "Paul wanted me to offer you a deal," she continued, her composure cracking like fine porcelain. "Half of everything, just like the original will specified. He'll stop the investigations into your work, your mother's care, everything goes back to normal." Laughter bubbled up from my chest, sharp as broken glass. Normal? Was it normal when your husband tried to destroy my career? When he sent men to terrorize my mother in her hospital bed? When he covered up our father's murder? The words echoed off the chapel walls like accusations from heaven itself. My phone buzzed again, a message from Claire. The SEC was officially investigating. The FBI had opened a case. The carefully constructed house of cards was collapsing, each fall creating a domino effect of revelation and ruin. "I don't want half," I said, watching Catherine's reflection splinter across the stained glass. "I want justice. I want truth. The kind of truth that can't be buried in offshore accounts or sealed with corporate settlements." The door opened again, admitting John and a team of federal agents. The warrant they carried wasn't just for company records, it was for Paul himself. Charges of financial fraud, conspiracy, and most damning of all, evidence suggesting he'd slowly poisoned our father with untraceable compounds, timing his death to prevent the truth from emerging. I watched them lead Paul away in handcuffs through the hospital's back entrance, his empire crumbling around him like the walls of Jericho. The man who'd once radiated such power and contempt now looked small, diminished by the weight of his own choices. In the aftermath, as reporters clustered like vultures and share prices plummeted like stones, I returned to the safety deposit box one last time. Among the evidence and documentation, I found one last letter from my father, dated just days before his death. My dearest Maria, by the time you read this, the truth will have done its work. I knew what Paul was capable of, knew the monster I'd created through my own weakness and silence. Your inheritance isn't just wealth, it's the chance to rebuild something better from these ruins. You have my strength, but more importantly, you have your mother's heart. Use both wisely. Standing in my office days later, watching the sun set on a changed world, I finally understood the true nature of legacy. It wasn't in the buildings that bore our name or the accounts that held our wealth. It was in the choice between power and justice, between vengeance and redemption. The Blackwood Empire would rise again, but this time built on a foundation of truth rather than lies. The board had appointed me interim CEO, a position I accepted not for power, but for purpose. The same hands that had helped heal patients would now work to heal the damage done by decades of corporate greed. John wrapped his arms around me as we watched the city lights blink on, each one a star in a constellation of possibility. Was it worth it? He asked softly, his voice carrying all the concern and love that had sustained me through this crucible. I thought of my mother, finally free to speak her truth. Of the communities that would receive long overdue justice. Of the legacy I could now build, one that would honor both my father's final wish and my own moral compass. Some inheritances, I replied, watching our reflection in the window, are measured not in dollars, but in the debts we choose to repay to the world. The woman who stared back at me from the glass was neither victim nor avenger, but something far more powerful, a healer who understood that sometimes the deepest wounds required the sharpest scalpel to excise the poison of the past.